Ahead and get started. I'd like to thank you all for coming out today to this Federalist Society event, the International Criminal Court, An Obstacle to Peace. Our speaker today is Professor Ronald Rychlak, who is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and the Mississippi Defense Lawyers Association Professor at Law at the University of Mississippi. He's been there since 1987. Professor Rychalk received his BA at Wabash College and his JD at Vanderbilt University. Since 2000, he has served as an advisor to the Vatican's delegation to the United Nations and a delegate at the UN meetings on the International Criminal Court. So he's got a great deal of experience in the subject that he'll be addressing us on. Over the past 2 years, he's also done diplomatic work with the United States Department of State and the Justice Department. He's a fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and an advisor to the International Solidarity and Human Rights Institute. He's also the author or co-author of 6 books and a number of articles. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rychalk.
Thank you very much. I really am delighted to be here. When I was deciding between law schools, it came down at the end between Duke and Vanderbilt, and so I'd been accepted here, so it's always been very high in my esteem. I feel like I've finally reached here. Particularly, I grew up in Indiana, and Indiana, of course, is basketball country, and I am of Polish heritage, so the ground where Coach K treads is sort of very special to me on a lot of reasons. And what a great day to show up to with the big game tonight. I watched the overtime game on TV Saturday, so it's been very interesting. I'm also glad to have the opportunity to work on this. In this coming August, I will travel to Bangkok, Thailand, for it's not really a debate so much as a back and forth discussion, but with President Philip Kirsch, who's the president of the International Criminal Court, and of course one of the primary architects of the court, to discuss the impact of the International Criminal Court. I admire the aims of the International Criminal Court. I think that tyrants should be punished. I am not opposed to the ideas behind the court. I think if you don't know about it, let's talk about it. I suppose I should introduce it a little bit to you. The International Criminal Court is designed to be a court that will punish the perpetrators of the worst crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and the crime of aggression. Crime of aggression remains undefined so far, but it's designed to get these really, really bad kind of people who perpetrate these horrible evils on the world. It evolved out of, originally the idea really out of the trials following Nuremberg, following World War II at Nuremberg, the trial of the Nazi leaders. And it was sort of hammered out with the statute, the Rome Statute in 1998, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and then was debated, signed, ultimately the 60th ratification brought it into being about 2 years ago. And the court is currently being put together in The Hague. It is different from the International Court of Justice in that it is a court designed to prosecute individuals. When two nations have a boundary dispute, a treaty dispute, a dispute over mineral rights or environmental pollution, you hammer that out in the International Court of Justice. This court, the ICC, will not have jurisdiction over nations. It will have jurisdiction over individuals. So if you get a real bad person, a bad dictator, someone who's done evil things, they will stand court. Kind of the idea being kind of like what Saddam Hussein would be facing today. A standing court prepared to prosecute those kind of criminals. The statute, the Rome Statute, however, is called a statute, not a treaty, because it does purport to modify customary international law, and in that way can at least have some pretty serious implications for non-signatory nations. And that's one of the main concerns that a lot of critics have, one of the concerns the United States has had, one of the concerns that I have with the court is that it opens up the possibility for use in some ways that I think are improper, and we'll talk about those a little bit further as we go along. Mentioned the three crimes that have been decided upon: genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The crime of aggression so far has not been decided upon. They haven't been able to work out the definition of that. Essentially, they're trying to take the concept of just war theory, which has been around for well over 1,000 years now, and try to reduce it to a statute. And that's very, very difficult, particularly when you have nations that view things very differently. I've been in the room twice. I'm glad it happened a second time, because the first time I almost didn't believe what I heard. But the first time, where the delegate from Cuba stood up and argued that the refusal of the United States to trade with Cuba should be considered a crime of aggression and prosecuted in the ICC. The delegate from Germany later stood up and said the crime of aggression does not take place until a nation invades another nation, ousts the leadership, and physically occupies the nation. Had I been from Germany, I would have let a different nation make that argument, but that does sort of illustrate the different way that different nations look at crimes like this. Of course, we have those four crimes, and people say, well, we're only going to go against the most serious perpetrators of these really horrible crimes, but that's a little bit deceptive, because each of these crimes is much further defined and broken down more specifically, so that a serious threat to mental health can be prosecuted in the ICC. Outrages upon personal dignity can be prosecuted. The crime of forced pregnancy has an interesting history. I won't go into the whole thing, but obviously the delegates from the Vatican were very concerned that this would mean an international right to abortion, and they worked hard to keep that from, to draft a definition that would exclude that from being possible. I talked to the priest who was involved in that, who was spat upon by some lobbyists after that for forcing through that, for seeing that this court was not going to create that as an international right. The Article 31 of the Rome Statute also sets forth some defenses, which I don't think Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin would be invoking. A mental disease, perhaps, but intoxication is a defense, or can be a defense. Self-defense, defense of force can be a defense. Duress or necessity, mistake of fact, mistake of law can be defenses. And there is a limited defense of superior orders. Of course, that was rejected in Nuremberg, and it is limited in this case. But it suggests to me that there is a lot of room for prosecution of people at something less than the worst crimes against humanity type of thing. Supporters of the court will say, well, now, wait a minute. The limiting factor, and if you hear me if I walk away? I've got a microphone on here. Okay, I'll get away from the podium a little bit. The limiting factor that people who support the court will always talk about is called a doctrine called complementarity. And the drafters of the court put in place this idea of complementarity that says the ICC will not prosecute anyone unless the nation, the relevant nation involved, whatever that might be, first declines to do so because it is either unwilling or unable to prosecute the tyrant. That raises some issues. First of all, who decides what does it mean to be unable or unwilling? And what it really means is the judges of the ICC will decide that. But also, I think it raises another issue, and that is, why did they invent a new doctrine, the doctrine of complementarity, when there was an existing doctrine in international law, doctrine of subsidiarity, that essentially did the same thing? This was when I first went to the ICC meetings, when I first was reading about this back in the year 2000, that was kind of what jumped out at me. You've got this existing doctrine, subsidiarity, that you could use to accomplish the precise same thing, that you instead invent a new term to try to do. And why the difference? And we'll come back to this a little bit later, but as I looked at this, the only thing I could really find is that subsidiarity is based upon a moral component that comes out of a long line of sort of Christian thinking. Complementarity is devoid of the moral component and absent any sort of religious underpinning. And maybe that's okay, except I think when this fits in later, you start to see some of the problems that evolve with this. The Statute of Rome was signed by President Clinton in 2000 or 2001. It was after the litigation in Florida was resolved so that we knew that George Bush, not Al Gore, was going to be president. So it was after that took place, but before Bush was sworn in. When President Clinton signed it, he said, I am signing this, but I will not submit it for ratification, and I do not believe my successor should submit it for ratification. Jesse Helms said it would be ratified over his dead body. There's been no senator who's ever come out strongly in favor of ratification, although when I first started looking at this, it was never even mentioned. And then one day my wife is a big fan of The West Wing, and there's an episode of The West Wing devoted to the ICC. And then it came up in one of the presidential debates, the ICC. So it's been creeping onto the radar screen. The Bush administration, in a very unusual, really unprecedented thing in international law, unsigned the ICC. Usually if you sign a treaty, you sign it, you submit it for ratification, and it's ratified or not. The Bush administration announced that they were not going to submit it for ratification, and in fact, they would not be bound by the signature, and so they declared it to be unsigned. A lot of people were critical of them for that. I think, in fact, that actually showed respect for international law. The Bush administration had decided they really didn't want this thing. It was a bad thing. They were going to work against it, and you're not supposed to work against a treaty if you have signed it. And so they said, we don't consider it sound, we want to unsign it, so that they were free to kind of do that, to work away from it. The Bush administration's main concern and the main argument, the argument which I think is fairly weak, the argument has been, our soldiers go everywhere, we're the world's policemen, they're going to be exposed, they're going to make mistakes, we know mistakes are going to happen. We don't want them to be subject to prosecution. We know we'll police our people, we do that, we have a history of that. We don't want foreign nationals to sit in judgment of them when they've made a bad call somewhere. We don't want Henry Kissinger or former presidents to be brought before this international court after they're out of office for crimes they committed while they're making decisions during times of war or whatever. We don't want that. And that's sort of a nationalistic argument that doesn't play real well with the Europeans and a lot of the people who kind of think we should be moving in this direction. Watch where I put my hand again. The argument, I think, that makes more sense comes from looking at the impact of the court itself. What's this court really going to do? The court is really designed for a transitional society. When you've had a bad, evil regime in place and it's been ousted one way or another. That's really what we're mainly talking about here. Maybe voted out of office, maybe left office, but more likely forced out of office. And there really are three, maybe four responses, four things that can happen in that situation. The first case is you have basically an overthrow and a civil war. The oppressed minority declares war, chops off the head of the king, storms the Bastille, and puts a new regime in power. Or there's a long, prolonged civil war. The first one is kind of war. Nobody wants that. We'd like to avoid that. And the ICC obviously is designed to try to avoid that. The second one is the Nuremberg principle, where you have a regime and they've been ousted and you give them a trial and you prosecute them, and if they're guilty, you punish them. Maybe you hang them like they did at Nuremberg, or maybe you put them in prison for life for a limited time or whatever. But that's sort of the judicial model. And that makes a lot of sense in some cases. I think it made perfect sense following World War II in Nuremberg. I don't think it makes sense in every case, though. There's some cases, the third situation, where you convince an evil tyrant to leave with the promise of amnesty. Pinochet in Chile. He'll leave office if he is promised that he will not be prosecuted for the rest of his life. Charles Taylor in Africa, it's a similar kind of thing. He's sought refuge now to leave office in exchange for a promise that he will not be prosecuted. If Chile is seen as unwilling or unable to prosecute Pinochet. His amnesty has kind of fallen apart, I know, but it got him out of office. But if Chile is seen as unable or unwilling to prosecute him because they granted a national amnesty, the ICC will step in and prosecute him. The judges will determine that the state is unwilling or unable to prosecute. The ICC expressly is written so that it will not recognize national amnesties. It doesn't want the dictator to cut a sweetheart deal and escape justice that way. Understandable in principle, but in the impact that it has, if it keeps the tyrant in power for a long time because he's not promised amnesty, I don't think it's a really good approach. I spoke to a lobbyist, I call them non-governmental organizations, NGOs, people at the UN who are really pushing for the ICC. Spoke to a member of one of these one day, and I said, well, what about Chile? What about the situation where you have Pinochet remain in power? And she said, I've been down there, people don't think justice was done. Well, I understand that justice may not have been done, but he left office. The alternative is he's still in power and the reign of terror is continuing. The fourth response, other than the pure amnesty, is a related kind of response that can happen when we have a transitional society. That's what happened in South Africa, where you have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people from both sides come forward and say, I did this bad thing, I'm sorry, not going to do it again, not going to do it again, and fine, go on your way, go and sin no more, we're not going to have civil war. That's basically just a different form of amnesty. But that has held the peace so far, a fragile peace admittedly, but in South Africa that has held the peace so far. The alternative likely would have been a bloodbath. Archbishop Desmond Tutu has often spoken of the need to forego retributive justice when trying to achieve peace. Truth, justice, and reconciliation often are competing factors. Sometimes you got to forgive to maintain the peace. Any of you have been married, there are times, my wife has had to forgive me. There's no real, I don't deserve being forgiven, but we can either fight forever or she can forgive me, right? It's kind of like that. Sometimes that has to take place. I spoke again to an NGO lobbyist at the UN one day, and I said, what about this? You're going to do away, the ICC will do away with Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. To which she said, well, if that's the case, then so be it. It just has to be. I took her aside. I said, that's the wrong answer. The correct answer for your side, and this is the correct answer for that side, is we're going to have good judges. We're going to have good people. And if there's a real Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they're going to recognize that, and they will credit that, and they will not prosecute. That will not be considered unwilling or unable to prosecute. So we're going to have good people. We're going to put our faith in good people. I'll get to the good people theory in a minute. But back to the Desmond Tutu idea of giving up retributive justice. We do that in the United States all the time. At the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln could have put a lot of Southerners on trial and had trials and executions that lasted for a decade or more for crimes that were committed against the United States. But he decided it was better to try to achieve peace than retributive justice. We allow people to plead guilty and get a lesser punishment because there's a balancing, there's a trade-off we make there. Sammy the Bull Gravano admitted to being at least an accomplice in 19 murders, and he got off with almost no punishment because we needed his information to get John Gotti. It was a trade-off we made. I personally represented one time a guy who was involved in organized crime in Chicago. And I'm the only one I know who done. I know it's happened else time, but I'm the only one so far I know it. He still got 10 years in prison, but it was under a new name. So I feel like my client didn't really get sentenced. It was a different guy who got sent away for those 10 years. Well, this raises the question of whether Nuremberg is a good model for a transitional society. You know, when it's a bank robber we catch, we put him on trial and we punish him. If it's a firefighter who goes on an illegal strike, you're not always going to have the trial there, even though it's illegal. There's prosecutorial discretion. There's executive clemency. That's not supposed to be there, but there is jury nullification in some cases. Even statutes of limitation are in effect a recognition that sometimes there are other values that outweigh retributive justice. Sometimes it's better to have a degree of certainty to say, that crime, okay, that's over with, forget it, we're going ahead, even though the bad guy gets away. There are other factors that outweigh that. The problem with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is that it favors the prosecution, the criminal trial, in every circumstance. It's basically an unconditional surrender type of model. When you apply that model to Nazi Germany, it made sense. The Allies had declared unconditional surrender. There was no trade-off that was going to be made. There's argument whether there was some in Japan, but the announced policy was no trade-off. You go in, you conquer them, you capture their leaders, you put them on trial, makes perfect sense. In a lot of cases, however, it makes sense to have some kind of trade-off. In a transitional society, you may need to give up retributive justice. Sometimes to preserve the peace, you need to let even the bad guys have a role in reconstructing the society afterwards. This has been pointed out what happened at the end of World War I. The Versailles Treaty was very oppressive to Germans. Germans were the bad guys in World War I. They were beaten. The victors get together and they put all kinds of conditions. We're going to take away the colonies. We're going to make them pay reparations. We're going to take away this property from them. We're going to demilitarize them. We're going to give Poland access to water. We cut a strip through Germany to do that. Very oppressive to Germany. A lot of people say, you know, that's what bred to the discontent that led to World War II. They didn't have a role in constructing that peace following World War I. Sometimes you got to give even the bad guys a role. One time in New York, I met with Ben Ferencz. Ben Ferencz was one of the great movers and shakers and promoters of the International Criminal Court. He was a big advocate for it. I guess it is still a big promoter of it. But I actually haven't seen, since the court came into being, I haven't seen him at the meetings. I think his goal was to try to get it established. He was also a prosecutor at Nuremberg. And I talked to him about his theory for this, and he said that well, I remember most specifically, at one point he held up a finger and said, you must understand, I'm a one-worlder. In other words, he believes that if we have one government, one approach, we'll be able to resolve these disputes between different peoples. And so having a court that can do this is a good thing for him. Sorry about that. First of all, one of the questions you have to ask, though, is at any given point in history, there are more civil wars going on than there are wars between nations. So if we have a one-world kind of government, one world situation like that, are we really going to stop the wars? Are we not going to still we'll have a court there, but how effective will the court be in stopping anything? That's one big issue. Jacques Maritain, who authored the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, French philosopher, once wrote a passage that I don't have exactly memorized, but he said, you know, the goal for a new legal order, a new world order based on law, and he was a promoter of it. I mean, he's a big guy of the founding of the United Nations. He says, it may be a good thing, but we got to understand it's really not much different than the old idea of empire building when kings tried to conquer things. You know, it's kind of a matter of who's in charge there, whether it will be a good thing or a bad thing. You've got to have a basis for it. He actually was kind of critical, even though he was the author of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. At the end, he said, okay, well, we agree on this, but we don't know where it comes from. We don't have a foundation for it. He was a big Christian, big Catholic, so he kind of would have preferred to see a grounding that way. And he said, I'm glad to see we have agreement, but if we don't have agreement where these rights come from, we're going to have problems down the road. Okay, I talked about the downside of the ICC. And you could say, all right, he's a little worried about these things. That's but it's not horrible. It's not the end of the world kind of stuff. And I'll agree with you with that. If I saw an upside to the ICC, it might be worth taking these risks. But I don't see much of an upside. The ICC, the principle, and you look at anybody who's written about talking about it, the principal thing is deterrence. It's there to deter the tyrant from doing bad stuff. Well, first of all, the people who support this and are always arguing deterrence, I ask them, do you believe in the deterrent effect of the death penalty? No. Do you believe in the deterrent effect of nuclear power or nuclear arms? No. But you do believe this court will deter tyrants. First of all, tyrants are surrounded by yes men and a military. It's pretty hard to convince them that they're going to get in trouble to start with. See if anybody catches this reference. Mo Howard is the dictator over Moronica. Nobody got it. Okay, you're Duke. You're too smart. It's a Three Stooges reference. But, he's got his military around him. He's not going to expect anybody to get to him. They know if they're overthrown, they know what they might face. I've got a book written in 1942 called The Trial of Adolf Hitler. It's talking about if we get Hitler, what we're going to do to him. They know that the peasants may storm the Bastille, bring out the guillotine, and chop off their head. They know, but they think that's such a remote cause. Well, if we're thinking about deterrence, everyone who studies deterrence says it's a factor of two things: certainty of punishment and severity of punishment. The ICC, in terms of certainty of punishment, well, we're going to give you a lawyer, we're going to give you a form of due process, we're going to give you a trial. You're probably going to be less likely to be punished at all with the ICC, if you're overthrown, than if it was the peasants storming the Bastille. And in terms of severity, the ICC does not have the death penalty. So you're probably going to have less punishment, less likely to be punished, and less severely punished. I don't see how that contributes to deterrence in terms of things. I sometimes say, I think you might be more likely to have a deterrent effect by blowing up big posters of Mussolini hanging upside down in the gas station in Milan and post them outside of the palace or whatever, and so the leader will know that could happen to them. But there's no real upside that way. In terms of prosecutors, a lot of people compare the ICC prosecutor to a global Ken Starr. There's not any check and balance with the ICC. You don't have a legislative branch, you don't have an executive branch, so you've got a prosecutor who can really do a lot of stuff. Well, we'll rely on great men. We'll rely on good judges who will not allow this to happen. Americans don't believe in that. We believe in checks and balances. We don't believe in the great man theory, with the possible exception of Coach K. But for the most part, we don't believe in trusting good people to do good stuff. We've seen too much of how power corrupts. Europe does have this model of the great man leader, the great person leader. That leads to Hitler, Napoleon, Mussolini, Stalin. We get bad leaders sometimes in the US, but they don't stay because we have checks and balances. They don't get absolute control. Another thing that concerns me about the ICC, the ICC came into being when the 60th ratification was submitted. And they did this big production. Every nation wanted to be the 60th. So there were like 10 nations that could have been the 60th. So they had a joint ceremony where 10 nations got to present theirs on that day. So 10 different nations could claim that they were the 60th that brought the court into being. The next day, I was invited to tea with the Polish ambassador to the UN. One of the rare times in my life, touching the microphone, rare times in my life that my last name actually paid off. I got invited. And we were talking about what happened and why he was really concerned. Why is the U.S. so opposed to the International Criminal Court? And ultimately I said, I think one of the big things is we have watched a federal court system grow. Federal courts were very limited, and we've seen them assume more and more power as they've grown over time, and they've gotten into more and more areas and more control over our lives. And there's no reason to believe that the ICC will not do that. You're going to have 18 judges, standing court, full staffs, sitting around at some point or another, thinking we need to do something to justify our being, to justify why we are here. He said, oh, don't worry, we're Europeans, we won't do that, which, trying to be a diplomat, I tried to hold a straight face there, but, I've seen what's happened in other nations. When the 60th ratification was submitted, one of the most appalling things for me as an American, the delegates at the UN gave a standing ovation to the NGOs, the people, it's like Congress giving a standing ovation to the lobbyists. With the Abramoff scandal, maybe they would do that, but they wouldn't do it in front of cameras and in public. The groups in the audience then, by the way, they held up signs. I don't know if you saw the Super Bowl sign where they did the beer pouring, but they held up signs and spelled up, "Women welcome the ICC," in the chamber as that was happening. Ben Ferencz, the One Worlder guy, got a standing ovation himself. He was introduced by the court and got a standing ovation. It's the legislators applauding, giving standing ovations to lobbyists, basically. That's the way I see it. Since then, I think the meetings at the ICC, I was just at one 2 weeks ago. I think the meetings at the ICC, there's been a lot more backdoor stuff that's happening. There's a lot less debate. Things are getting hammered through very quickly. The meeting 2 weeks ago, is there evidence of growth of the ICC? Well, there was a report card on the rights of women that was handed out at the ICC. I'm all for, I have a wife, I have a mother, I have 5 daughters. I'm all for rights for women, but the court is not about trying to achieve social balance in all the various nations. At least that's not how it was presented when it was put together. Looking at other organizations, the EU in recent years has pressured Poland to change its values on issues like gay rights and abortion. The UN Committee on Human Rights has pressured Peru to change its abortion law. Another EU committee has called for assisted suicide, same-sex marriage, and contraception to be considered basic human rights protected by the EU. The president of Ted Turner's United Nations Foundation has charged the Bush administration with crimes against humanity because of the abstinence program that it uses to fight AIDS in Africa. And the World Trade Organization recently held that the United States was violating international law by prohibiting internet gambling to be legalized. There are these kind of pressures that will come about. We're putting together this court that I think will function to promote more of those kind of things. One of the delegates, Poland's delegates to the EU, recently said the way that he feels things are happening with the EU feels like it was in Poland prior to 1989, in other words, under the communist regime. Well, what expansions might happen? What do we see? And you may even favor these things. I'm not here as an advocate for the death penalty or against socialized medicine or different military actions, but the court clearly will have the ability to step in and issue rulings related to these kind of things. That's the concern. We will need to amend our own criminal procedure laws, what constitutional rights we give to criminal defendants, so that it will equate with the court. Court committees have already said that. Nations need to amend their laws to conform to that. What things do I think we can do? I think you can create a political body. One is kind of emerging with the Assembly of States parties, so you get kind of a legislature. The legislature that they have, if that becomes a legislature though, it does kind of violate the idea of one person, one vote, because the smallest nation gets one vote and the most populated nation gets one vote. And so there's a democratic idea behind that, but there's also a very anti-democratic idea behind that, and that needs to be thought about. The UN does have the Security Council, and the drafters of the court really want to get out from the Security Council to get away from the veto, particularly of the United States. I think the main thing, I'm not opposed to drafting these laws. I'm not opposed to drafting procedures. I think having the standing court with 18 judges sitting around feeling like, gee, we need to do something to justify our being, I think they're going to start looking. There have already been calls to expand into international drug trading. There's been a call to expand into terrorism, not currently covered. by the ICC. I think that the judges are going to feel a lot of pressure that way, and we're going to see the court grow into some of those areas. If some kind of check is not put on to prevent that, I think the court will either become meaningless or it will actually interfere with the penal process. And if that happens, the court will have exactly the opposite of its intended effect. And with that, I would like to take any questions or answer any comments or whatever that you may have. If anybody wants an extra sandwich, you can get it now too.
You mentioned that there's no checks and balances through a legislature and a executive, but do you think that perhaps the fact that there's no strong executive to back up the court might be another limiting factor on it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. What is the impact of there not being an executive branch? They don't have a military. So if you've got Saddam Hussein, who of course Iraq is not a member, but you've got a dictator and they're a member of the court and they're charged with violating. The nation has a treaty obligation to turn the charged person over to the court. If they don't do it, you either live with it or you start a war over it. And the only way you start a war is if you get nations to donate troops. So yeah, it is a limitation on the impact that the court will have. But you end up with a situation then where a nation like the United States is charged with aggression in Iraq. We have to decide to either turn over our president or to be in violation of this court that we don't really think should exist to have this jurisdiction in the first place. So I think that's a problem. It does limit its power, though, which is probably a good thing. Any other questions? I've answered everything. That's good to know. Yeah. Great.
Have any of the nations that joined been countries with the dictators that the court would seem to be put in place to work against?
No, that's a great question. The nations that join, for the most part, of course, or the nations that avoid joining, I should say, certainly nations with dictators don't sign up. Most Islamic nations have not signed up because they do have punishments that, frankly, I could see calling people, cutting somebody's hand off for shoplifting or something like that. I could see that maybe being called a crime against humanity or I mean, I don't think that's a good thing. I'm not in favor of that. And yet, I'm not sure if there should be an international body that comes in and says you can't do that. The doctrine, I said that the court developed the doctrine of complementarity to replace the doctrine of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity says it is a moral obligation that problems be handled at the lowest level possible. If the family can resolve a dispute, the family should. If the family can't, the community. If not the community, the city. If not the community, not the city, the state. If not the state, then the international world or whatever. But there's a moral imperative to keeping things resolved as close to the problem as possible. The ICC, says, well, we'll consider what the nation does, but we want to have ultimate decision-making authority, ultimate control. We always have the final say there. And I think part of the reason they went from subsidiarity to complementarity is precisely so that they would have that authority. And I think that's all part of the moving away from sort of a more, shall I say, moral-based system to a more politically based system. Okay, strayed a little bit from your question there, but any other questions? Yeah.
What authority does the court have over non-governmental actors like multinational corporations and things like that?
If that is a good question because it's designed theoretically to get the decision makers. However, if an actor from a corporation were in a nation that is a member of the ICC, and if they did something that constituted one of these crimes, And, you know, it's hard to think immediately of what would jump out at you as something they would do if we're really going to fairly identify those crimes. But, you know, if we're going to trump things up, because that's a big concern right now, if things getting trumped up. I think that they could be prosecuted if they commit one of those crimes on the body, you know, on the land of a nation state, a member state. The trumped up charge thing, I went on last night just to double check the state of Israel. Israel had signed the Rome Statute fairly early in the process because, again, you know, who's not in favor of punishing really bad guys, stopping genocide, stopping crimes against humanity, stopping, you know, unjust wars? Everybody's in favor of that. They signed it, but Israel figured out pretty quickly that its leaders were going to be targets of prosecutions in the ICC, and indeed, immediately Palestine began lobbying. Now, Palestine hasn't been admitted as a nation, and Israel's not a nation, so right now it's sort of immune unless it does something outside its borders and basically the whole Mideast pretty much is. I'm not sure if there's any member from the Mideast that could look. There might be, but most nations in the Mideast have not joined. But if Israel does, Israel will be immediately a target. As the U.S., I think, will be immediately a target because this is a way for nations to fight back against what they perceive to be unjust actions. And when you try to do it in the UN, you get a Security Council veto. And the U.S. there's always complaints that the U.S. protects Israel so much that way. The ICC is intentionally constructed to make sure it's not part of the UN, primarily to get away from that Security Council veto. At the last meeting, just 2 weeks ago in New York, a lot of discussion on the final day was where are we going to have our future meetings. And they had tried to move them over to The Hague, to the new buildings that they're putting up over there, but they really don't have all the translation facilities and everything to make things work. It works really well in New York at the UN building. But they really want to be separate from the UN because they really want to get out from under the Security Council veto. Security Council currently has the ability to delay prosecution for a year at a time. So they have some control, but that's a compromise that the folks really pushing for the court don't like that at all either, that they even have the ability to delay prosecution. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about something you said earlier. You said the argument for the Bush administration and the military is going to be exposed to unfair prosecution is a relatively weak argument. And
I wouldn't say it's weak. I would say it appears nationalistic in a way that offends a lot of Europeans. It's not incorrect. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but it's not that it's inherently weak. It's that it appears like. All right. I'll try not to move. I'll just try not to laugh. It appears like I feel like I'm rigged with a bomb here or something. Watch too much Kiefer Sutherland. It appears like we're trying to protect our soldiers, allowing the rest of the world to go at risk. We've always been the big promoters of prosecution, of international treaties, of making sure everyone plays the game fairly. I mean, that's sort of been the United States stamp, that we've always argued in favor of these kind of things. Now, finally, there's a court being put in place to really enforce this kind of stuff. We're saying, whoa, wait a minute, we're not sure we want to be part of that. That looks bad to the Europeans. I actually think that it's valid. It just, I don't think it's the argument that fly. I think there's a much more important argument. The much more important argument is that this court may prolong dictatorships. It may lead to more civil war, civil unrest, instead of preserving the peace in some cases. It's going to work fine in some cases. The model works in Nuremberg. It doesn't work in South Africa or in Chile. That's what I think. Anything else? You want to finish your question? I know I kind of cut you off.
that's fine. I wanted to know if you, for political reasons, or if you believe there was actual substance to that, the worry about unfair prosecutions, because it seemed like you were concerned about the court encroaching upon other legal areas or using it as a vehicle for political agendas. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think there is reason to be concerned that you're in a time of war and I'm losing and I don't like what the opposition is doing, and so I turn to a world court and allege that they are violating these international norms and ask for them to grab the leaders on the other side and put them on trial. You know, the U.S. Marines are not going to allow officers of the ICC to come and take our president or our generals. I mean, it's not going to happen. And if they catch somebody, I do believe our Marines would go in and free him. I mean, I think that's, and so that cuts against the whole strength of the court anyway. But it does, I think, it would be a hampering effect on decision making.
I just want to ask what you believe was the role of accountability then in the case. If the ICC is not going to be a vehicle for accountability, what is? In transitional society where the judicial bodies are either corrupt or they can't deal with it, are they simply not the answer?
You know, I'm not opposed to having even the standards in place, the rules in place, the laws in place, the procedures in place. My big concern is the standing court. So I can see having a procedure in place where in an appropriate situation we're going to have trials of these people. But I also think you've got to allow negotiated settlements. You've got to allow truth and reconciliation commissions. You've got to allow national amnesties. Yeah, sometimes the bad guy is going to cut a sweetheart deal and get away. You know, if that brings the dictatorship to an end and does so peacefully, avoiding civil war, that's a trade-off I make. You know, I'd prefer not to have to. I'd prefer to take all the bad guys and put them on trial. But I just don't think that you can put in place a mechanism to assure that without really just upping the ante and increasing the chance of a prolonged civil war. Anything else? Well, I appreciate you coming. Go Blue Devils tonight. Thanks.
Bureau, in which the secretary of, at the time, at which secretary of, in charge of the economy, secretary of the Central Committee, Mr. Slunkov, was trying to persuade the colleagues that in this crisis circumstances, they have to radically cut down the military expenditures. He was not supported. There was a chairman of the government, Mr. Rychalk, who was trying to persuade their colleagues that they have to increase prices. He was not supported. So they decided that it's better to close the eyes and look what will happen. Of course, at the time, Soviet Union still had the reputation of the perfect borrower, very high, and could get significant amount of the credits. So practically what they were doing, they were trying to do nothing, hoping that the high oil prices will come back. Because if you don't have, for instance, money to import grain, you cannot explain to the cow or to the pig that it will have to wait 20 years until the oil prices will be back on the previous level. So you have then somehow find the money to continue this import of grain. Where can you do it? On the market. So they started to rapidly borrow. And that is the strategy which in many cases was adopted by the oil-dependent countries after the significant decrease of the oil prices. So the simplest solution is just to close your eyes and borrow and hope that somehow the situation will be resolved. So that's exactly what the Soviet leadership started to do, starting from 85, 86. But then, somewhere around 88, the market started to understand that the situation is unsustainable. And also, in all of the correspondence, it's evident that Soviet authorities are more and more informed by the Soviet negotiators, that they are getting the messages from the investment community that now path to the commercial credits is closed. Now, if you need the credits, then go to the governments. So that means that you can not only bring additional financial resources from the market, you have to use your current earnings, which are still extremely low, to repay your short-term debt. So you are not starting to have the serious problems unresolvable with the current account balance, but also you are starting to have enormous problems with capital account balance. When you do understand it, you start to understand what we were doing in the Eastern Europe. Because when and if you are confronted with either economic and political catastrophe, or you will be able to bring huge amount of politically motivated credits from the fund, from the bank, from the international governments, then you are in an absolutely new position, because everybody knows that these credits are politically motivated. They are not from the market, they are from the governments. So real world is a real world. So when and if you urgently need a politically motivated credits, they started to be political factor. And to imagine that, for instance, in '85, to imagine that the Soviet Union government would ask for politically motivated credits, the country which they regarded as their potential enemies, with whom they were in the state of the Cold War, it was out of any imagination. Now in '88, it started to be absolute reality, and it's evident that no other choice do exist. If you do understand it, it is easier to understand, for instance, why Gorbachev on Malta assured Bush informally that we will not use force in Eastern Europe. Because if it was evident that if we would use force in Eastern Europe, there would be zero chances of the politically motivated credits. But excuse me, all of the Eastern European part of the empire was rested on the idea that Soviet Union any moment could use force. When the East European governments, elites and societies in the spring '89 understood that there is no danger of practically no practical danger of the use of the Soviet military to support the dependent regimes, in a few months the fate of the East European part of the empire was resolved. It was evident that it will disintegrate, it disintegrated. Even when the governments were prepared to use the force, like in Romania, it had not helped. But then, excuse me, if when you are in this type of negotiations, and the Gorbachev many times are repeating the world's $100 billion. When you need $100 billion of politically motivated credits, then somehow you have to understand how should you behave not only in the Eastern Europe, but inside the country. Americans, of course, told Lithuanian delegation quite openly that they will not recognize the government if they will declare independence, and will do nothing to support their military. But also the Soviet authorities were told that if we will use intensively force in Baltic states, then let's forget about politically motivated credits. But well, excuse me, all of this society is structured on the idea that the authorities are prepared to use as much force as necessary. And now you're telling them that they cannot do it. And our society starts to understand that they cannot do it. So where it is leading you, I would not tell you the exact details of the story, they are extremely interesting, but generally this contradiction between all of the economy and society based on the very high oil prices, radical downfall of the oil prices, radical worsening of the situation on the consumer market, worsening of the credit situation, politically motivated credit, a limitation of the use of force, and then complete disintegration of regime. Very few really important factors, and behind of them, of course, this instability of the oil price, unpredictability of the oil price. To which degree the downfall of the oil price in 85, 86 was politically motivated? About this, there is a lot of literature. To which degree the agreements between the Americans and the Saudis played the role here? I think played. That's my guess. And I have a chance to speak with some people who were involved. But they never thought really about the destruction of the Soviet Union. They were just thinking about how to a little bit weaken it. But then, of course, it tells a lot about the quality, intellectual capacity of the Soviet leadership of the time. To use the oil revenues to invade in Afghanistan, which was regarded by Saudi Arabia as a danger, and which radically improved the relationship between Saudi Arabia and United States, military support of which was now quite necessary. And then make your economy entirely dependent on the solutions which could be done by your major potential enemy and your major competitor, and wait until they will somehow agree between each other, that you have to be extremely clever and far-seeing thinkers. But that's another direction on which the influence of the fluctuation of the oil prices is important to understand. Well, and that is the relationship between the oil prices and the quality of the IQ of political leadership. I cannot prove it, but on the basis of everything I have seen in Russia during last years, I can tell you that there is a strong negative correlation. The higher oil prices, the lower IQ of the Russian leaders. Of course, it works with the luck. It works with a few-year luck. For instance, if you just remember, those who do remember, the picture of the Brezhnev Politburo of the 80, and would remember that the oil prices at the time were significantly higher than now, then you can understand how can you get this quality of the leadership, which could put your country, which is more superpower, in such danger, and that's also one of the factors why I do not like very much present high oil prices. As I mentioned, usually they work with the time lag. But if they will continue to be as high during next 2 or 3 years, I do not know what the quality we will have in 2008. So, dear friends, it really looks strange, but it is a very, very serious problem. And of course, you can manage it. You can manage it, especially if you're a stable democracy. If your economic management is competent, you can create stabilization fund, you could push and promote responsible economic policy. But it is a challenge. Thank you, dear friends.
Mr. Gaidar kindly agreed to take questions. I know he has another appointment in about 5 minutes, but I think we could probably stretch that and maybe take about 10 minutes of questions. I ask that you keep your questions brief and make them end with a question mark. That will facilitate a rapid response. Yeah.
You mentioned that basically Russia has decided not to recycle the oil dollars back into the Russian economy. And you mentioned 3 areas there. Education, and now if they're not investing in education, where are they going to be 20 years from now? Aren't there going to be significant problems? You mentioned the environment, again, the same thing. Russia has a lot of environmental problems now and in the past. And you mentioned pensions. And if people are looking and saying, this is going to be so tough now, you know, they're going to decide the economy is tough. I'm not going to have children. Russia's population, I think, is going down. Do you think that's a wise policy that they're doing?
Yes, I think that's wise policy. Because had nothing against the expenditures on education or healthcare or pensions. I'm strongly in favor. But you have to base these expenditures on reliable sources. When you will base your pension obligations on the source which you could not control, how will you eliminate, or you will cut pensions 3 times when the oil price goes down? Will you eliminate the educational commitment when price will go down? We have 2 sorts of the revenues. We have a growing non-oil economy. Of course, with this fluctuation of the oil prices will once again start to be very significant part of both revenues and the export revenues in the budget. But we are having quite dynamically expanding non-oil related sector. They are creating for us stable sources of their revenues. So when and if you are speaking about education, healthcare, pensions, they should be stable sources. When we are having, for instance, rapidly increasing revenues from telecommunications, splendid. Let us spend it on the healthcare. When we have rapidly expanding revenues from the food processing, perfectly. Let us put it on education. If and when we are having now rather dynamically developing timber or machine building, let us increase the pensions. But let you not make the commitments which you will not be able to fulfill, because then it will be much more dangerous for the national economy, for the pensioners, for education, for the healthcare, because then you will have to sack doctors when the situation will be worse. We will sack teachers, we'll have to close schools.
A central problem, as you've raised it, is the lack of diversity in your economy. Do you think you can use at least a portion of this additional funding to address that sort of central problem?
Yes, but it would be a terrible mistake. Because you will trying to do the good thing, and you will do exactly the opposite. That was many times tried in the oil-dependent countries. You're telling, well, we have now the oil revenues, let us build these, let us use them for the diversification. What practically follows? Practically follows very rapid real appreciation of the national currency. Very rapid real appreciation of the national currency makes your industries uncompetitive both on the external market and the internal market, because you have the increase of the imports, non-oil related, and decrease of the exports. So you're trying to diversify the economy. And usually state is not very good in the quality of the investment projects which it implements. And especially the state in oil-rich countries, when the quality of the state administration usually is not perfect. So you are confronted with a serious danger that a lot of money will be just stolen, but stolen and spent in a national economy, and that will mean appreciation, and that will mean that in the 5 years, as a result of your efforts, your economy will be more oil dependent than now.
As I understood, your advice is not to use oil money from oil. For example, for such countries as Kazakhstan, it's like a good idea to use oil money for diversifying of economy.
I think it's dangerous policy. You can use them. Well, you are doing a lot of if you're speaking about Kazakhstan, you're doing a lot of very sensible thing with the oil money. On what you can spend it. You can spend it to build the hard currency reserves, which will make your investment climate looking better and will make you more investment attractive. You can use them to help build the institutions which are promoting economic growth. To use them inside the economy, it's rather dangerous from my point of view. Private investments, as all the history shows, and our history also, are usually much more efficient than the state investments. Because the private person is spending his own money. And it's very limited chance that he would like to steal this money. And the state employee is using other people's money. And there is a high chance that he would think that he also has a family and the good friends, and why should not he help a little bit from this state money, those who are close to him. And I'm not speaking theoretically, I'm speaking entirely practically. For instance, when just one example, current example. There was a discussion about the building of the new pipeline to Nakhodka on the east. Before the UKOS affair, UKOS proposed to build this pipeline for its own money, from the private money, not from the budget. And they calculated that it will cost approximately $4.5 billion. So they were prepared to spend their $4.5 billion of their own dollars to build this pipeline. Now we are building this pipeline from the state sources, so from the taxes which we are paying. And it first started to be not 4.5,